and welcome to the webinar, Do Drug Patents Cause High Drug Prices? The State of Play on the Empirical Evidence, hosted by the Forum for Intellectual Property at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Devlin Hartline, a senior fellow at Hudson, and I'm delighted to be here moderating this panel discussion today. Before I introduce our three panelists, I'll give some brief introductory remarks to frame our discussion. For the past decade, policy advocates have argued that drug innovators artificially extend the length of their exclusive patent protections for the sole purpose of keeping drug prices high. These advocates have succeeded in prompting a massive policy debate about the causes of drug prices, with drug companies branded as the villains. By now, most everyone in DC and many voters have heard the politically charged attack on drug innovators. They are accused of engaging in so-called evergreening and creating patent thickets to artificially extend their control over top-selling drugs, thus keeping prices high for longer periods of time. Policy advocates support their arguments with eye-popping numbers of patents on drugs that allegedly prevent generic drug companies from selling their own lower-priced versions. These numbers primarily come from two sources: an organization known as I-MAK and the Evergreen Drug Patent Database at the UC Davis School of Law. I-MAK is a policy organization that believes that patent monopolies are the cause of high drug prices. And over the years, it has published splashy reports citing massive numbers of patents on top-selling drugs. For example, 68 patents on Lyrica and 79 patents on Gleevec. And the Evergreen Drug Patent Database has been cited for similarly high numbers of drug patents and for claims that patents continue to protect drugs from competition that have been in use for many decades, such as aspirin and insulin. These claims about patents protecting drugs for decades have been relied on by Congress and agencies to drive legislation and regulatory actions that weaken patent rights on life-saving drugs and other healthcare treatments like diagnostic tests. But are these patent numbers reliable? And are Congress and these agencies engaging in evidence-based policymaking? These are pressing questions given the importance of the US patent system as a driver of innovation in healthcare, both historically and today, with almost 2/3 of all new drugs being invented in the United States. The US has been the global leader in the biotech revolution that has vastly improved everyone's lives throughout the world. And the launch pad for this revolution has been reliable and effective patent rights in the biopharmaceutical sector. So in this webinar, we will be discussing the crucial issue of the need for evidence-based policymaking with two scholars and a representative from the innovation industries. Our panelists today have done some of the rigorous empirical studies on drug patents and considered whether the allegations of patent thickets and evergreening are more rhetoric than fact. Joining us today, we have Erica Litzen, a professor of law at the University of Missouri. We have Adam Mossoff, a professor of law at George Mason University and a senior scholar at Hudson. And finally, Corey Salzberg, vice president and global head of IP affairs at Novartis. If you'd like to see all of their impressive achievements and accolades, you can use this wonderful technology brought to us by the patent system called a search engine. And so with that, I'd like to ask the first question to Adam Mossoff. Adam, could you briefly describe your 2022 Hudson policy memo, how unreliable data have infected the policy debate over drug patents, and the conclusions that you reached?
Thanks, Devlin. So real pleasure to be here and delighted to be participating in this important discussion. So one of the prompts for this continuing discussion about the actual evidence underlying the attacks on drug innovators was the very large numbers of patents that were asserted to exist by an organization that you identified called I-MAK. And I just want to set the context. I-MAK, it's not a think tank. It's a policy organization. It's an activist policy organization. As you mentioned, it believes that so-called, quote, patent monopolies, unquote, are the primary cause of high drug prices, and it seeks to remove that cause. It has actually even filed legal claims as an organization. It filed the very first petition at the PTAB to invalidate the path-breaking drug for treatment of hepatitis C, Sovaldi. So it's not a think tank. It's not something that sets itself out as doing rigorous research. As you mentioned, it presents these numbers in these splashy pamphlets. They call them reports, but there's no content to them other than just the numbers that they're asserting, of which you identified. So you mentioned Lyrica, which they claim has 68 patents on it, and others. And so I was really interested in this. So I went and tried to find some of the public sources that list the patents, and to find out what they said compared to those numbers. And what I found was a shocking vast discrepancy between the numbers that were being asserted without any data or explanation of how they reached those numbers in these pamphlets that they've been issuing for a very long time, and the actual numbers of patents that are listed in official public sources like the FDA's Orange Book, which is the official location, especially if you're generic, for identifying all the relevant patents that cover the active ingredients in a drug and would cover that drug for purposes of a generic who wishes to make a competing product. So, so I just did a quick spot check on some of their listing of the drugs that they have in their brochures, and compared them to the numbers in the Orange Book, and just kind of threw it out there and saying, well, look, there's a vast discrepancy here. So, for instance, you mentioned Lyrica, which is a drug that treats nerve pain. Sorry, it's a drug that treats pain caused by nerve damage, caused by diabetes and shingles and other types of injuries. So I-MAK claimed that Lyrica has 68 patents covering it. And when you look at the FDA's Orange Book, it identifies 4 patents. And actually, there's actually only really 3 patents. One of them is a reissue patent. So in reality, it's only 3 patents, not 68. I mean, that's a difference in order of magnitude, literally. I mean, we often sometimes use that phrase as rhetoric, but this is literally a difference in order of magnitude. And moreover, I mean, really eye-popping claims about even a continued exclusivity that should have undergirded the evergreening arguments that, they're continuing to extend out the patent protection. So I-MAK asserted that, Lyrica was going to have exclusivity all the way up through 2038. Now, they said this in 2018 and 2019, which was really shocking because in 2019, the FDA approved 6 generics to compete against Lyrica in 2019. So, like, in the very year that they're saying, oh, they will have exclusivity on this drug all the way for another 20 years, they already had approved 6 generic competitors. And there's many other examples that I identified in my 2022 policy memo. So Eloquai treats blood clots after surgery. Again, really important for people surviving the surgery. I-MAK said in 2018 that Eloquai had 27 patents on it, and it said that there were another 48 patent applications pending. And then in its new pamphlet that it issued in 2019, it claimed that there are 31 patents on it. It increased the number by 4, from 27 to 31. And then it said there's now 49 patent applications pending. It didn't tell you how it got those numbers. It just asserts these numbers. They're just in a nice splashy chart. When you go and look at the Orange Book for Eloquai lists 3 patents. 3, not 31, not 27, 3. I mean, and these are identified patents with patent numbers and everything in the Orange Book. So there was something really strange here, right? Something was rotten in the state of Denmark. And so I just kind of threw this out in this policy memo as kind of saying, maybe they have an explanation for this, maybe not. They don't explain their methodology. They don't disclose their underlying data. So, we just don't know what's going on here. And this is why the title of my policy memo in 2022 was how unreliable data has infected the patent policy debates on drugs. And so, interestingly enough, when I released this memo in early 2022, it got the attention of Senator Tom Tillis, who within a couple of weeks wrote a letter to I-MAK saying, we would really appreciate if you disclosed your data and your count and your analysis, your methodology for how you reach these numbers based on your data. And he also wrote letters to the FDA and to the USPTO saying, you need to now investigate this because this is really serious, because this looks like Congress might be making legislation, and agencies might be actually taking official action on the basis of incorrect, invalid numbers. And so this kind of prompts this discussion. I know that Erica has been engaging in this research for a while too. So I definitely want to now turn it over to those guys because I want to hear what they have to say as well.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Adam. And that's incredible to me that they like won't show their work, you know? That just seems like basic research 101. So Corey, I'll ask you. So Adam mentioned that Senator Tillis requested that the Patent Office and the FDA do their own study of the empirical data on drug patents for the ones that have been listed in I-MAK's publications. And this past June, the Patent Office released its study. Could you tell us what it found?
Yeah, so I will, first of all, thanks, as Adam said, very much for the opportunity to be part of this discussion today. I think it's really important. It's a really important topic, and that's what I want to focus on as I answer your question, because people need to understand that this is not just, one study versus another on two pieces of paper battling each other. This has real world impacts. This is really important information because, again, it's been driving, drug policy discussions, legislation, regulations, all of the rhetoric around town. And as I'll explain in a minute, I mean, the numbers of patents on things actually have really important impacts, not just on competition, but also innovation. So let me summarize it this way. I think there are two main takeaways that you get from the USPTO study. And I will get into what it says about I-MAK towards the end in a minute. But I first want to say that I think the first big takeaway, at least from a practical perspective, is that we have been having the absolute wrong conversation about patents in America. When you focus on how many patents cover a medicine and when the very last one of those patents expire, number one, as the PTO study shows, and I'll explain this in a sec, you don't get useful or accurate information about competition, which is what purportedly groups like I-MAK are trying to show, but you don't get useful information about that. But what you do miss is crucial information about innovation. So that's, really the first point. The second one is that even with respect to those wrong questions that are being asked, right? How many patents are there? When does the last one expire? As Adam just explained, you're basically getting the wrong answers. You're getting information that is totally inaccurate and really grossly out of whack with the real numbers. So let me elaborate just a bit more on those 2 points because I think they're particularly important, again, with the real world impact. The first is on the usefulness of patent numbers and their latest expiry dates. So I'd say the PTO study, and people can look at it if they want, and I'll actually give some page numbers if people want to, take the time who are watching to investigate. Most of these are on pages 57 and 58, and it makes three main practical findings. And the first one is that simply counting patents doesn't tell you anything useful about if or how those patents are going to impact generic entry. The second point, I think it makes big conclusion that higher patent counts don't necessarily correlate with later generic entry. There are examples in here, and maybe I should explain briefly what the study does is it takes a cohort of 25 different drugs, and that's a very small sample, I will say. It's representative, but it's a small sample compared to the number of drugs that are in the Orange Book over the last several decades. So it's important to consider both. And I know Erica has done her own research, which she'll talk about, which takes a broader look. But basically, even if you look at those 25, there are examples of drugs with the longest effective exclusivity periods in there that have only 1 to 3 patents. And then there are others in there with the shortest exclusivity periods that have 5 or more patents. So that tells you something. And the third thing is that there's a definite correlation, and the study even says this, but this is where I want to spend a minute explaining it for people kind of in lay terms and get an understanding of what actually happens, with medicines. But there's a correlation between having multiple patents and having higher levels of complexity of innovation inside of a drug. And the study concludes that this is actually very common, not just in the drug industry, but across all industries, especially when you have complex technologies, you can expect to have more patents there because they reflect more innovation. And then that last point, I really want to explain. I like to call this your tablet is a tablet. And here's why. Because if you think about the kind of tablet like an iPad, right, your tablet device, That's a complex technology, and most lay people will understand, oh, there's lots of different inventions in here. There's a calculator, there's a clock, there's all these, there's software, there's buttons, whatever. And by some estimates, to put this in perspective, there's something like 250,000 patented components. I know a New York Times study did that years ago in a smartphone or a smart tablet. But for some reason, when people think about the type of tablet that you take when you're sick, right, like a pill, they tend to think it's only a single invention. And as we know from experience, and now the PTO study explains, that's just not the case. And so here's some data. I mean, developing a medicine takes 10 to 15 years on average. We have an 88% failure rate, even when we start our clinical studies. And the 12% of medicines that actually succeed, of candidates that become a drug, the reason they do is usually because there's all of this ongoing innovation that happens after you file your first patent. There's this whole development phase, 10 to 15 years, and this includes new formulations, developing the indication, so that's the use, the dosing, the routes of administration, the manufacturing methods, all these different things. And the more complex the drug is, the more challenges you're going to have to overcome with more innovations to actually make it one of those few successful drugs. So that's a bit of a practical explanation. But even with all that innovation, if you look at the PTO study, the average number of patents that it concludes or on the products in the 25 sample drugs that were selected is about 8.6. When you look at all Orange Book listed medicines, and Erica can talk about her study, but there's some previous studies that showed an average of 3 to 5 patents across all Orange Book. And to put that in perspective, again, I mean, some golf balls have more than 70 patents on them. They're a little round white dot. And why does this matter? Well, because when you have 10 to 15 years to develop a medicine, right, that's how long it takes. If you were to rely on only your earliest filed patents, you'd have no term left effectively by the time you have to get over that finish line, and there'd be no medicines because you'd have no incentive to finish doing it. Just a couple more quick points. So the second thing, really important set of findings in this PTO study, it then looks at there's been a lot of criticism and scrutiny of patents that are filed after a medicine is launched. As this study explains, though, this is on page 5 of the study, while patents may issue on changes to a patented drug or new uses of that drug, those patents that are filed later, they don't extend the earlier patents, as these groups claim. They don't cover the original version, and they certainly don't prevent generics from making the original version of the drug. The study also, again, correctly notes that this is very common practice across all industries to patent later inventions that build on earlier ones, because that's, of course, what creates the incentive to keep innovating and keep making things better. It's why we don't have still the iPhone 1, right? I mean, not to single out Apple. I know I mentioned, iPhone and stuff, but I'm just, it's a common household item. That's why I'm using that example. So, and another way to think of this, I said before, your tablet's a tablet. You can think of this as your tablet as a wheel, right? How many times has a wheel been reinvented again and again and again? There are still patents on wheels. The PTO study actually does a similar thing with, I think, eyeglasses. It talks about how, we've been 120 years or something of patents on eyeglasses because they keep being made better. Just a quick example of that, like the first HIV drugs were failed cancer drugs, antiretrovirals. Aspirin's 100 years old, but we continue to find new medical uses for that. That doesn't mean, though, that you can't find generic aspirin. Just go to any drugstore and you'll find it. So let me just end with really quick the importance of data integrity, because I know that's kind of a key takeaway, but I really wanted to spend that minute or two, whatever it was, just talking about the practical realities here. But in terms of the numbers, the PTO study unequivocally debunks these claims by groups like I-MAK and others that patented medicines are blocking competition, by generics for 30 to 50 years, I think is what their reports say, 38 years on average or something. The drugs in the PTO study, if you look at the actual impact on generic entry, had a range of between 3 and 16 years, with an average of about 11.3 years of market exclusivity before generic entered. And that's right in line with multiple previous studies of the whole Orange Book, which show an average of 12 to 14 years. And for context, this is really, again, a practical point. It's well below the 20 years that the patent system internationally is supposed to give you for, that's an invention by invention basis, but still, I mean, the goal is 20 years and we're getting 12 to 14 on average. It's even below the minimum 14 years that the patent office, that our statutes are supposed to give us through patent term extension, which is when you kind of offset the delays from the FDA, you're supposed to get at least 14 years, and we're not even getting that. So, and just to give you a very last thing for my opening remarks here, a sense of how bad the data is. You mentioned in your opening our drug, Gleevec is our drug, one of our cancer drug, a life-saving breakthrough cancer drug. So a 2017 I-MAK report claimed that that first of all, in terms of exclusivity, that it had 35 years of exclusivity with the generics only entering the market in 2029. Adam made a point with a similar drug. In our case, the generics had already launched 2 years before I-MAK had published that report. And Gleevec's actual market exclusivity was less than 15 years. And the same report claimed that Gleevec was covered, I think the number they said was 73 patents, when the real number was 5. And we've checked this, time and again. There were 5 patents only in the US ever covering Gleevec, not 73. So I'll stop there, but hopefully that gives you a glimpse of, what we've been saying for all these years. And now the PTO study finally shows that, in fact, these numbers are just grossly inaccurate.
Yeah, wow. I mean, it's shocking how inaccurate they are. Yeah, thanks, Corey. That was great. Erica, I'd like to turn to you. And as a patent law scholar, you've spent significant time and effort over the past several years doing some rigorous research on the drug patent numbers in the drug pricing policy debate. Could you please give us a brief summary of what you found?
Sure. So first of all, I like everyone else want to say thank you for hosting this. It's a lot of fun to talk with Corey and Adam about these issues. I want to start by saying that the PTO report that Corey was just describing came out after the major piece of work that I'm going to talk about, and I found it really gratifying that it came basically to the same conclusions that my co-author Christina Acree and I did. So, as we've been talking about, right, there have been all of these studies, various legal scholars and health policy scholars putting out these empirical studies. I'm putting I-MAK to the side since Adam talked about what I-MAK is and their numbers. And I have been focusing on what some of the scholars have put out. And in particular, what I'm going to tell you about is some work that we did pressure testing the Evergreen database that Devlin mentioned, the one that's hosted by the University of California. So again, sort of they're part of this larger body of work that is counting the number of patents, sometimes also FDA exclusivities, focusing on the number and on their expiration date, with a special attention that's being paid to the patents that issue after the drug was approved and that expire, sometimes 20 or more years after the drug was approved. And the basic claim that is being made is that through these patents, the drug company has extended its monopoly in some sense. And I'm going to tell you what we found, but I want to start by kind of giving you a little bit more detail, explaining what is conceptually wrong with what they're doing, because there's a basic conceptual flaw that allows them to play kind of fast and loose with the data. So the Evergreen database at the University of California, what they are doing is counting every individual patent that is listed with an approved drug application. And then they take the expiration date of the latest expiring patent, and they say that's the big date on which the drug's monopoly might end. But here's the problem. FDA approves more than one product on a single application, and the individual products are legally distinct. So that means that there are 3 basic conceptual flaws with taking that last patent expiry date as meaningful. So number 1, a generic company copies a specific product. It doesn't have to copy all of them. Number 2, surprisingly often, a patent that is listed in the Orange Book that Adam was talking about, a listed patent will be associated with one of the products and not the other ones. And third, the patents that are listed with, associated with a particular product that the generic company is trying to copy, those patents might not cover things that the generic company has to copy. In other words, it might be a formulation patent. In most cases, a generic drug doesn't have to have the same formulation as long as the active ingredient is the same. Or it might be a patent for a new use that the brand company studied and then added to their labeling, and the generic company doesn't have to include that. So the point is that a generic company can avoid some of those patents that are associated with the product that it's copying, get its drug approved, and even have its drug be deemed substitutable. So now just sort of to take a step back, what that means is when you treat all the products on a marketing application as a single product, and you treat all of the patents associated with all those different products as equivalent in power against generics, you come up with, and the Evergreen database comes up with, a number of patents that is completely meaningless. And when you say that the latest expiration date is the end of the monopoly on that drug, it's the date at which the company has extended its protection cliff, you're making a claim that cannot bear out in the real world. That's the problem. That's how we get these artificial numbers. So Professor Akri and I looked at 224 approved new drug applications that are in the Evergreen database. And the corresponding generic drug was commercially available on average 7 years before the date that was being proposed as the monopoly end date. And we looked at, within that group of 224 new drug applications, we looked at 79 new chemical entities. So those are the brand new molecules brought to market. And on average, they had generic competition more than 5 years before that supposed monopoly end date. So, and I'll say one other thing about this data set that we studied. One of the things that we found, in addition to those conceptual flaws, was a variety of methodological choices that were made that consistently biased their results in one direction, which was towards higher patent counts. And I'll give you the example that is the most straightforward. If PTO reissues a patent, the Evergreen database counts that patent twice. They count the original and the reissue as 2 patents. But of course, that's not how it actually works. The reissue patent replaces the original patent, and there's only 1 patent with the same expiration date. So they basically made a methodological choice that doubled the patent count there. It's not 1, it's 2. And that's consistent throughout their data set. So we found a variety of methodological choices like that that consistently bias the results in that one direction towards the higher patent count, which of course is rhetorically powerful and supports a lot of these reform proposals that are so problematic.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. That's really fascinating. And I wanted to just ask you a follow-up question. So you've done these empirical studies with Dr. Akri on the total patents covering specific drugs. Are these the first ones that have been published by economists and legal scholars, like without using the numbers from I-MAK and the Evergreen Drug Patent Database? It seems weird that this hasn't been done before. Why did it take so long?
Yeah, I suppose the answer is that no one did this before we did, because before now, people weren't kind of peddling these problematic data sets to support their reform agendas. We used to hear a lot of anecdotal claims about evergreening, to be clear. And I published another article in 2020 in which I reviewed literally every single article in the legal scholarship. I'm going to say that again. I published an article in 2020 in which I reviewed literally every article in the legal literature and most of the articles in the medical policy literature that even mentioned evergreening, and cataloged all of the individual examples, which is all it was before, individual examples. And when you looked at those examples, many of them were hopelessly confused, right? They had their facts completely wrong, or there were actually generics on the market, which they had missed or ignored. But it was just anecdotal. It's only been in the last, I want to say, decade or so that we started to see attacks on drug innovation that are grounded in these bigger data sets that are being put together. And so once policymakers were being asked to pay attention to claims about problematic patent counts and supposed monopoly extensions based on purportedly exhaustive and careful data sets, once that started happening, it became important for us to set the record straight. So I think that's the answer. This is a new phenomenon, and it has made it really important for us to try to set the record straight.
Well, that's great, and I'm glad you're doing this important work, as I'm sure Corey is too. So, Corey, I'd like to turn to you. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but I-MAK is including the number of patent applications when it gets to its number of patents covering a specific job, a drug. Could you explain? Why does a patent application not have an exclusive effect for generic companies? Because it sounds like they're staking a flag in the ground and saying, I'm claiming this land now and I'm going to build on it later. Is that right? Is that how it works?
There's a few things to say about that. First, in terms of are they counting patent applications? Sometimes it appears that's the case. Other times we just don't know, as Adam knows well, and he can maybe comment on this after. At least some of the early reports didn't even say what they were counting. They would just spit out these numbers, and it was impossible to tell what they were even trying to count. In the case of our Gleevec example, we know they have kind of this mysterious chart in the report that seems to show patent applications. It doesn't name which ones they are, so we can't actually track what, and it doesn't align with our data, by the way. But they just say, X number of applications, X number of patents, things like that. But yeah, among that number of 73 that they're saying, they actually use the term 73, a total of 73 patents, it says. And among those 73 patents, 44 of them that they allege are they actually admit earlier applications. And they're saying that's a patent. So applications are not patents. They're two totally different things. The best way I could explain an application just at a very high level first, it's like any other application, right? If you apply for a loan or you apply for a grant or you apply to win a sweepstakes, it doesn't mean that you actually get the loan or the grant or win the sweepstakes. It just means you've applied. So there's really, it's the same concept in patents. It gives you nothing. It gives you no actual property right in anything. Again, like maybe just because I know, look, I have, obviously I'm speaking from the perspective of a patent owner here, but look at the PTO report. The PTO itself on page 13 explains, I'll just read, for the audience here. This is quote, the study includes only granted patents and does not include pending or abandoned patent applications. Abandoned applications, and by the way, I'll explain that in a minute, but abandoned applications do not result in granted patents and thus do not pose a barrier to competition. The study also does not discuss pending patent applications because they are not listable in the Orange Book and may never become patents. And if no patent is granted, there is no enforceable right. As a result, the total of all abandoned and pending applications is not a meaningful metric. So that comes from the PTO study directly. Let me just quickly explain. So I just explained in general what an application is. A pending application simply means that you've applied. You don't have an answer yet. And the way patent prosecution, which is the process of securing a patent in the first place, works is you submit an application with a relatively broad description of what the general field of kind of the general idea of what you've invented, and then you can kind of conclude it with what you claim, meaning that defines the actual metes and bounds of what you're actually going to have in patent protection if you actually get that patent granted. But what happens is you go through this process of several years with the PTO to talk about what's actually new compared to what came before, what we call prior art. And as you also, at the same time, you file your patent application, and as you're starting to do the continued development work on your medicine to kind of figure out the best way to do it or the right approach, you start to refine more and more of kind of what what you've invented. So that by the end of the process, the original application ends up with something far narrower. So in many cases, if you do get a patent granted, it's going to be much, much narrower than what is actually in the application. And many times you actually don't get the patent for a couple of reasons. One is sometimes it turns out that you actually can't meet the patentability criteria for that particular invention because it's too close to what's happened before. In other situations, you decide not to pursue that patent because you've decided that, at the beginning, I'm going to file a patent in, a general field of a particular class of molecules, for example, and then you figure out there's only one of them that's really useful. So there's no point in continuing to go through that process. And the upshot is that It's important to remember that generics and other competitors, which is what everyone seems to be worried about, are sophisticated businesses that analyze and challenge patents as part of their business models. This is what they do for a living. They absolutely know the difference between a pending application, an abandoned application, and a granted patent. And then maybe just one more quick point on this, particularly on the abandoned application, because this is really important. I-MAK, at least in our case, absolutely counted abandoned patent applications. What this means is that you filed the application and then you withdrew it, right? It's gone. You're not actually going to get a patent by definition. That's what it means to abandon the patent application. And I actually refer to abandoned patent applications as anti-patents. As shorthand, because they usually, again, they reflect this process of narrowing the scope to what you actually are going to patent, because it reflects what you actually care about, and the rest of it you don't. So you don't pursue those routes. But the most important thing is that when you abandon that application, everything that you've not claimed gets dedicated to the public. And in most cases, that application is going to be published. So the public learns about what it is that you've invented, but you're not actually claiming the patent in it. So it actually all goes to a public service. And there was a study done in 2020 by Kotropia and Schwartz called The Hidden Value of Abandoned Applications to the Patent System. And I love it because they actually say it's absolutely correct. Here's a quote from that study, that the upshot: by narrowing the scope of new patents, abandoned applications perform a public service in limiting exclusivity over any given technological space and opening up more invention space to the public domain. They do so at an enormous private cost to the abandonee. So in other words, we're basically dedicating, what could be very valuable to the public when we abandon an application. It's the exact opposite of what a patent does, which is gives you exclusive rights. This is giving the rights to the public instead.
Yeah, only in the land of I-MAK is attempted patenting a crime.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Corey. And that's it's insane to me that they're counting abandoned patent applications and pumping up their numbers. And clearly that doesn't make any sense, for the reasons that you stated, that these things are public documents and you're revealing whatever's inside to the world. And so how is that excluding other people? It doesn't make any sense. And so I'd like to ask Adam, like to hear from you. So, these reports that are coming out have real world impact with, lawmakers and regulatory agencies. And I'm just wondering if you could describe some of the actions by the FTC and the Patent Office that have been taken or are being considered to be taken on drug patents.
Yeah, thanks. And, in what you say is exactly right, because these little splashy pamphlets that they've been publishing that they call reports, right? They're specifically being sent to agency officials, to staffers. They bring them to their meetings. These are for consumption by policymakers. And I just want to say this because it's very, neat, can't be said enough, right? The USPTO FDA's report confirms everything that Erica has been studying, confirms, Corey's statement about the use of abandoned patent applications and other misrepresentations of the patent numbers that I-MAK has been pushing, and it confirmed the numbers that I found in my just kind of spot check in my 2022 policy memo. And so it's a really important publication now by the official agencies that did an empirical review of the matter and found I-MAK's numbers to be not even unreliable anymore. I think we can really start calling them what they are, which is either made up or manipulated or fake, or whatever is the term that we want to use for not legitimate numbers that are being asserted as in the policy debates. But unfortunately, because these numbers have been so prevalent and they're being pushed so aggressively to agency officials and to staffers, there's action being taken, because who wouldn't? A person comes into your office and said, there's 73 patents on this drug. Oh my God, generics can't compete with it. If your average staffer, 25 years old, 35 years old, doesn't know anything about patent law, your FTC person who thinks in terms of monopolies and crushing of competition, they're going to be like, oh my God, we have to take action here. This is serious. This is a problem. And as Corey, I think, very nicely explained, like so did Erica, right? This is asking the wrong question, right? You know, it's not the number of patents, but even if, because even if you're assuming they are, but they have therefore taken actions. Now, the first actions that were taken were, you know, these kind of continuing studies and listening sessions and requests for information, the USPTO, and well, maybe we just need better collaboration between the FDA and the USPTO on these patent applications on drugs. And maybe there's something nefarious going on here. There's no evidence of anything nefarious, as we've been talking about. And so, of course, you know, and of course, proposing, and at least initially, some what were, you know, at least prima facie sounding like innocuous claims, but nonetheless, you know, our proposals like, well, we should have more kind of regulatory exchanges between the two agencies, the FDA and the USPTO. But of course, ignoring the additional costs and time and everything that this would be imposing, and the additional questions and the bases that which people would then use as in these exchanges that would be new between the two agencies for further legal claims down the road, perhaps. But then actually the agency started taking real actions. So the FTC started sending letters to companies saying, you're listing too many patents in the Orange Book. Now, I want to make an important point here. The FTC started sending letters without any statement about legal liability or anything, but just saying you're listing too many patents in the Orange Book. Now, I want to emphasize this because notice that the claims that I-MAK has been making have been by orders of magnitude more than the patents listed in the Orange Book. And as Corey and as Erica have confirmed through their through their research, and the USPTO and the FDA have now as well, right? That that's the world of patents that matter and that exist. And so notice here, they're guilty if they do, and they're guilty if they don't, because I-MAK's response to my policy memo and to Senator Tillis's letters, which they filed a letter in response to Senator Tillis in 2022, 9 pages letter of which they were asked, you know, to disclose their underlying data and their methodology, and the 9 pages added up to the answer no. We're not doing it, while accusing drug innovators of engaging in, quote, opaque practices that mask what they are actually doing with their patenting practices, because and they started saying, like, well, they're not listing all the patents in the Orange Book, which is why you have these discrepancies, and the generics know about these patents outside the Orange Book. So the first accusation was they're not listing enough patents in the Orange Book. Without any basis for me saying this, of course. This was just a bald assertion. And now you have the FTC accusing drug innovators of listing too many patents in the Orange Book. So they're guilty if they do, and they're guilty if they don't. Like, which is it? Like, you know, it's becoming a moving target for, you know, in terms of what they're trying to respond to and what they're trying to address, and what the problem might actually be. But there isn't a problem. That's the point. That's how they can keep shifting back and forth with these alternating accusations. Then the USPTO has actually decided to take some serious actions on these issues. And so just this past summer, they are proposing some regulations to change actually some very long-standing, long-accepted patent application practices in the by innovators that, you know, have been long accepted and recognized as legitimate under the patent law. It's a technical practice called disclaimer practice, where you're following the patent applications for the follow-on innovations that were described by Erica and Corey. You want to avoid a particular legal claim that examiners would make against you called double patenting obviousness, which is that, you know, you're trying, you know, you shouldn't get this patent application. You shouldn't get this patent because it's an obvious next step on what you're actually invented before. So you can avoid this by saying, well, I'm disclaiming any added additional protection. That's why it's called a disclaimer practice. So if you issue this patent, the term is for the original patent, going back to the foundational patent of which this is a follow-on innovation to. So there's no additional exclusivity, 0, in terms of the actual term protection. And, you know, so again, this is a bonus. This is a benefit to the public in this way. And they're actually now, the USPTO, on the basis of these accusations of evergreening, of patent thickets, that is being driven by these numbers from I-MAK and from the evergreening patent database at UC Hastings, they are actually considering making this fundamental radical change to the ability to obtain this very important follow-on innovation that Corey described is necessary in that 10 to 12 year R&D process that costs billions of dollars for the drug innovators to come up with their next great innovations that are that are turning what were diseases that literally killed people, hepatitis, diabetes, even cancer and other types of illnesses, into actually not just curable conditions potentially, but even manageable conditions such that people can continue to live their day-to-day lives over a regular time span. So I mean, there's real action being taken here by regulatory agencies, actions that weaken and diminish and eliminate patent rights, actions that are imposing additional costs on drug innovators. And this undermines the very system that Corey described and that you described at the beginning of our discussion about how the patent system has been the driver of this incredible innovation in medical technology and medical healthcare in this country.
Yeah, thanks for that, Adam. And it sounds like the classic catch-22. You're including too many patents, you're not including enough, and you're wrong either way. So that was really interesting about the regulatory actions. But Corey, I wanted to follow up with you on what's happening in Congress. So I know there's proposed legislation, the Affordable Prescriptions for Patients Act, the Remedy Act, among others. Could you tell us what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, at a high level, what you're seeing is exactly the same kind of impact in legislation that Adam just described in regulation. You're getting these bills that are been introduced for the last several years, really since these I-MAK type reports and Hastings databases started surfacing. It actually has real world consequences. I mean, fortunately, so far none of these bills have passed, but they have been moving along in Congress, and they're all unfortunately based on this false premise that drugs are just covered by too many patents, and they're having these effective exclusivity periods that are too long. Again, I mean, the claims are between 30 and 50 years is what you hear repeated time and again on the Hill. And these figures that there's, an average, I think that they say an average of 70 plus patents, on every, or the top selling drugs. And you keep hearing these claims, and it's driving this legislation. So the first point I want to make is the PTO study now disproves this underlying premise. So all of the bills that have been introduced based on this premise, people, the sponsors ought to be taking a look at this and saying, is my legislation actually even justified, or is it really a solution, looking for a problem? And we, of course, think it's the latter. But let me give you an example. So the Remedy Act is one of the first ones that we saw to this effect, because it was originally introduced in 2019. It was reintroduced this year, I believe. So the Remedy Act stands for, and this tells you, part of the problem, right? It stands for the Reforming, Evergreening, and Manipulation that Extends Drug Years Act. So of course they're starting with this premise. You hear it right there in the title, that there's manipulation going on, there's evergreening, and there's the extension of drug years. And actually, if you look at what you can call a beauty sheet or a fact sheet about why this legislation, what does it do? It specifically and expressly reproduces charts from one of the early I-MAK reports showing several examples of drugs and how many patents they allegedly have around them, and how long the term of the term of exclusivity, or the years blocking competition, actually lasts. And those numbers are 30 to 40 years if you look at the chart. So that tells you right there, I mean, this is a direct consequence. Crafting legislation directly based on the false data that has been, peddled around in these reports. There's other problems with the bill, though, because it's not just a harmless bill. I mean, what it basically would do, this Remedy Act, it would prevent you from listing any patent in the Orange Book other than a compound patent. A compound patent is like the patent on the actual, the active substance of the drug. But all these other innovations, the formulations, the route of administration, the actual medical use for the drug, which can be novel, all those other patents would become unlistable if this were to become the law, on the premise that any other type of these patents unduly blocks competition. So there's at least three problems with this. So the first one is, as I just said, the premise that there's these patent thickets that are blocking competition is just false. So that's problem one. I already explained that. The second problem, though, is that the premise behind this idea that only a compound patent is somehow legitimate, and all other types of patents are inherently abusive or inherently gaming the system, is highly problematic. And it's also now been debunked by the PTO study. As I explained to you before, this would also be harmful to patients because all those other inventions are what are absolutely required to convert what would probably be, in most cases, a toxic compound by itself into the right formulation, the right combination of ingredients, the right uses, and the right dosaging and everything. So if you just eliminated all those kinds of patents, that would be a problem. But the third problem is that the premise of this piece of legislation, the Remedy Act, is to basically the premise is that it's somehow anti-competitive to be listing these additional patents in the Orange Book, but that's false because you only get a single 30-month stay, in the vast majority of cases in the Orange Book. That's what the law says. So you list them all together, you only get what's called a 30-month stay, which means it's I should explain for the audience, it's a 30-month period during which the generic gets to have what's called they file their ANDA, so their generic drug application, which is considered a constructive act of infringement. So the generic does not have to incur any risk of damages. They file this ANDA. It starts a 30-month period where you get to work out whether the patents are valid and whether they're infringed during this 30-month period without any risk to the generic. And then, by the end of that, they can launch if they want to, if either the dispute has not been finished or if they end up invalidating the patent. And the concern here, again, from this bill is, well, that 30-month stay is being abused because the premise seems to be that every additional patent that gets listed leads to another 30-month stay, and that's just not true. But the last thing I'll say about this is it would actually be really damaging for competition if this passed, because what would happen if you limited the Orange Book to only a single patent in most cases is that you would have that 30-month period and the constructive act of infringement by a generic, because they're always going to have to use the same active ingredient, right, to try to work out whether or not they infringe that particular patent. That would have a 30-month stay, and after that period were over, whether they win or lose, there would then be a second wave of litigation from all of the other patents that didn't get listed in the Orange Book. And in order to challenge those, they'd actually have to launch a generic product at risk, meaning that they would be at risk of actual damages, which would be prohibitively expensive for many generics. So what you'd end up doing is basically depriving generics of all the benefits of the Hatch-Waxman Act, and you'd be extending the period, really extending competition, the lack of competition, you'd be delaying competition during the period. So it would have the exact opposite effect of what it purports to want to do. In other words, that the Remedy Act would be no remedy at all to the problem it's identified.
Yeah, well, thank you, Corey. And those acronyms usually don't work out with the names of bills, in my experience. So we're getting close to the end of our time, and I have a question on follow-on innovation that I'll direct to Erica, but I'd invite Corey and Adam to chime in as well, and then I'll ask all three of you if you just have a quick closing statement that you want to make, and no worries if you don't. This has been in the news lately. So patents on follow-on innovation. So like new pill coatings for time release, or new inhalers, or auto-injector mechanisms for insulin shots. So these are called secondary patents. So Erica, are they secondary in the sense that they're less innovative? So people have been talking about this recently because Leslie Stahl and Lena Khan did a 60-minute segment recently on the FTC. Are these less innovative, and do they actually extend the patent term on the underlying drug?
I never really know what to do with the rhetoric around secondary patents. A patent is a patent is a patent, right? We all know this. If the invention is novel and useful and non-obvious, and you satisfy the various other requirements, federal law is going to protect the patent right for 20 years. Either it's patentable or it's not. And so I guess I would say I reject the characterization outright. It's a patent. One way to understand what's going on here is, a drug company, imagine it has a new chemical entity with a potentially significant therapeutic use. it's looking at 10, 12, maybe more years of R&D before it can get on the market with that innovation. That whole time, the clock on the active ingredient patent is ticking, right? Researching other uses typically has to wait because clinical programs are expensive, not to mention risky. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You develop a formulation that you prove is safe and effective for that first use, and then you launch to try to recover some of that investment, right? But there's so much more important work that could be done. There could be half a dozen other uses to study, sometimes entirely unrelated. The company might figure out how to reduce the incidence or severity of a significant side effect, maybe with a new formulation or a new dosage form. It might figure out how to develop an extended release formulation. And these are actually harder to do than people realize. Getting the coding right and so forth can be pretty tricky. An extended release formulation that smooths out the effectiveness over a long period of time, or that helps people stay on the medicine so they don't have to keep track of so many different pills, for example. So I'm not comfortable. Not only do I not like secondary innovation, but I don't even like that thinking about more innovative versus less innovative, right? And you started off at the beginning calling me a patent scholar. I don't think of myself as that. I think of myself as someone who specializes in pharmaceutical regulation and innovation policy. But from that perspective, an invention that benefits patients is innovation we want. And that's the way I think about it. And from my perspective, I am happy to let individual physicians and patients decide what they value in every instance. If it's an innovation and it satisfies the patenting standard, that's innovation we want. And that's the end of the discussion for me.
All right, that's fascinating, Erica. Corey and Adam, do you have anything to add?
Maybe just to build on that point really quickly. I mean, I think Erica is absolutely right. I mean, what we really want is innovators in every field to be the innovators, to see where innovation and science takes them, to follow scientific discoveries, apply them practically. And, a lot of times, as I said before, 88% of the time when you start even a clinical study, you fail. Those failures then often open up other possibilities, and you realize what you did wrong and you realize the right direction. And that's how science works. But the practical realities of drug discovery and R&D are such that you also need, it's very expensive, very risky, and therefore you need that incentive to actually, allow you to do that work. And if you have policymakers, to the point about so-called secondary patents, deciding that we're not going to incentivize this, that, or the other thing, we're only going to incentivize these things, then you're artificially skewing the process of science, and you're really, sending it in certain directions based on policy making by people who are not experts in this field. They don't know what they're talking about, right? I mean, they don't operate in the field of pharmaceutical innovation. They don't understand medical science. That's not what they do. So that's really, the choice. I think when you start to say things like, let's get rid of patents in this field versus that field, you're really skewing the process of innovation. And maybe just on my concluding thoughts on all this altogether, the PTO study basically validates what we've known all along, and what research by Adam and Erica and others have been showing. Not only their recent research, but also builds on consistent research that was done earlier, a bunch of studies. Now that we have, though, an official, objective, government agency looking at a sample and coming out again with consistent results, and again basically showing that these I-MAK and UC Hastings type databases are not accurate, it's time to stop citing them. And it's time to not just stop citing them, it's time to stop building policy proposals and potential legislation on top of data that has now been debunked. We really need to adjust our policy making, because if we start cutting the overall market exclusivity below the already low effective terms that we get, again, like no more than 12 to 14 years on average, we're just simply not going to have many more innovative medicines in the future.
Great, thank you. Adam, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. So, it's interesting that we're having this debate that's been prompted by, just these, assertions of patent numbers, that have now been confirmed as completely unreliable, and made up, and, mixing lots of different things that shouldn't be mixed. even assuming if these patent numbers are correct and that there were these number of patents, I think as described earlier by Erica and Corey, you know, economists have long known, and we have actually discussed this in other contexts at the Hudson Institute with respect to high-tech patents, that merely counting patents is not a metric for innovation as such, and that, you know, that you gotta have massive numbers of patents and a lot of innovation, or very few patents and still a lot of innovation, you know, because what matters is what are those patents do, and what are the patents covering. And, you know, and for all of the accusations and attacks on so-called follow-on patent or secondary patents and secondary innovation or inventions and things of this sort, right? You know, well, what's a secondary innovation or invention? 5G. And you know what was a secondary innovation after that? 4G. And those were incredibly important innovations and inventions that have driven, you know, our mobile telecommunications sector of our economy. So, you know, again, as just to reiterate and bring home the point that Corey and Erica had said in their closing remarks, you know, that you know, that this drive to enact policy on the basis of what has now been definitively confirmed by government agencies as unreliable, you know, unconfirmable, numbers that cannot be replicated, by someone who says, you should just trust us that we engage in a rigorous methodology. You know, I-MAK is now going around saying, well, we disclose our methodology. And if you go and look on their website, their website actually says, we count the patents very carefully. That's what they consider to be their disclosure. And I mean, so, I mean, these cannot and should not be relied on anymore, right? And I just want to kind of hammer that home, you know, that the principle of good governance is evidence-based policymaking. And what I think we have now definitively confirmed at this point, after years of careful, rigorous study by scholars like Erica, by reverse engineering of their own patent numbers by people like Corey, and by me, you know, weighing in on this with some additional insights with just a spot check, right? Is that what organizations like I-MAK and others are doing is not promoting evidence-based policymaking, but are creating a classic case of policy-based evidence making. And that it will not lead to good policy, especially when we're talking about the system that has been the driver of all the innovations in their medical care and the biotech revolution of the past 20 or 30 years. So this is incredibly important, and we need agencies and we need Congress now to sit up and pay attention to what their own colleagues in the government, their own experts are telling them now about what is the nature of the policies and legislation that they're proposing.
All right. Thanks, Adam. And I think the takeaway for me is that, you know, trust me, bro, is not evidence-based policy making. I love it. Policy-based evidence making. I love that. And so our time is up. I've greatly enjoyed chatting with all three of you. So I wanted to give a heartfelt thanks to Erica, Corey, and Adam for joining this Hudson Institute webinar on drug patents and drug pricing. And obviously, there's a lot more to unpack, and maybe future webinars we will get into some other issues. But for now, I just want to thank everybody for joining us, and hopefully you enjoyed the program.